White Elk looked peaceful beneath the first bright snow of winter. But Marlow heard something wrong inside the old bell tower. Everett found the crack and stayed silent to protect a painful memory. By morning, an ice storm had turned that silence into a missing rescue signal. To reach those waiting in the cold, Everett had to release what he treasured most. What followed was not one man's triumph, but a town learning to answer together. Tell us where you're watching from, and please like and subscribe as we work toward 1,000 subscribers. Marlow stood across the bottom of the bell tower stairs. A faint dusting of stone had settled over the German shepherd's black and gold back. His right ear remained upright, while the frost-damaged tip of his left ear curved slightly outward. Above them, something made a short, dry, metallic sound. Not a ring, not even an echo. It sounded like a small piece of something old finally letting go. Everett Sloan looked at the dog, then at the narrow wooden staircase climbing into the shadowed tower. Move. Marlow did not bark. He lifted his left front paw and placed it squarely on Everett's dark brown boot. Everett's face tightened. At 62, he still stood nearly 6 feet 2, with broad shoulders and the solid build of a man who had never stopped treating physical readiness as a responsibility. His faded olive and brown field shirt stretched across his chest beneath an open canvas jacket. The sleeves were rolled to his forearms despite the cold inside the chapel. A black military watch, its glass marked by a diagonal scratch, rested on his left wrist. His rectangular face had grown leaner with age. Silver showed clearly at both temples of his short, dark brown hair, and salt and pepper stubble covered his square jaw. Deep, amber-brown eyes studied Marlow with the same controlled attention Everett once reserved for unstable coastlines, broken equipment, and men who claimed they were fine when they were not. Marlow? The dog held his ground. Everett could have stepped over him. Instead, he waited. Outside St. Luke's Chapel, the first winter snow covered White Elk, Montana in clean, white light. The valley looked almost too peaceful to belong to the same country as storms. Sunlight flashed across the roofs of cedar houses, the narrow main road, and the dark pine forests climbing toward the mountains. Smoke rose gently from chimneys. Far below the hill, a county plow moved along the road like a yellow toy. On mornings like this, White Elk seemed protected by beauty alone. Everett knew better. One heavy storm could close the pass, pull down the power lines, bury road markers, and separate the town from the county emergency network before most residents finished their first cup of coffee. St. Luke's had stood on the northern hill for more than a century. The stone chapel no longer held regular services, but its bell remained part of the town's identity. Before radio towers and mobile phones, the bell had warned of wildfires, closed roads, and missing travelers. Different patterns once carried different meanings across the valley. One long toll called men to the fire shed. 2 warned families to leave the river road. 3 sent search parties toward the mountain routes. Most people in White Elk remembered the bell as tradition. Everett remembered it as a promise. He lowered his gaze to Marlow. "All right," he said quietly. "I heard it." Only then did the dog remove his paw. Everett climbed. The staircase was narrow enough that his shoulders nearly brushed both walls. Marlow followed 2 steps behind, moving carefully. The dog's rescue harness was hanging back at the cabin. Today he wore only a dark brown leather collar with an old brass buckle. His honey-colored legs contrasted with the black saddle across his back. A pale golden stripe ran down the center of his forehead, narrowing toward his muzzle. Halfway up, Marlow stopped again. Everett felt the pause before he heard it. A slight creak came from above. He placed one hand on the stair rail. The wood was cold through his palm. His thumb moved automatically across the edge of his watch, tracing the scratched glass once. "Stay." Marlow remained where he was. Everett continued alone. The maintenance platform sat directly beneath the bell chamber. Thin winter light entered through the wooden louvers, cutting across the dust in pale bars. The bell hung above him, dark bronze against blackened beams. Its surface bore decades of weather, cleaning marks, and repairs that no longer matched in color. Everett reached into his chest pocket and removed a short mechanical pencil. He always carried it there, clipped beside the field notebook in which he recorded every inspection. Temperature, wind, condition of the rope, movement of the wheel, visible corrosion. He believed in written facts. Facts did not soften themselves to protect feelings. They did not become more convenient when ignored. At least, that was what Everett had always told himself. He inspected the pull rope first. The fibers remained dry and intact. The wheel above it rotated with more resistance than it should, but not enough to explain the distorted sound. Everett climbed 2 steps onto the fixed service ladder and raised his flashlight. The beam found the bronze fitting at the crown of the bell, where the body connected to the supporting yoke. A thin crack ran through the hanging lug. It was barely wider than a pencil line, but it did not belong there. Everett leaned closer. One of the nearby steel pins showed orange corrosion around its edge. The metal had not failed, but it had shifted enough to leave a narrow crescent of clean surface where rust had broken away. Something glinted on the platform below. Everett climbed down and picked it up. A piece of bronze rested in his palm, smaller than a thumbnail and sharp along one side. For several seconds, the tower became completely still. Everett looked from the fragment to the crack. He knew the proper response: close the tower, mark the bell out of service, photograph the damaged fitting, call Lydia Mercer, the county structural engineer. Everett had no authority to decide whether the bell was safe. His responsibility ended with identifying the problem and reporting it. That boundary had once seemed sensible. Now it felt like a hand reaching for something that belonged to him. He closed his fingers around the bronze fragment. Below the platform, Marlow shifted one paw against the wooden stair. The small sound brought Everett's attention to the chapel floor far beneath them. Mounted on the stone wall beside the old altar was a narrow brass plaque. 2 names were engraved there: Daniel Mercer, Owen Rusk. Men who had once trusted Everett's signals without asking whether he was certain. The final operation had not ended the way any of them expected. Everett had spent years refusing to reduce it to one mistake, one delay, or one wrong decision. Real failures were rarely that merciful. They came from weather, timing, distance, imperfect information, and the terrible confidence people placed in one another. But memory did not care about fairness. Memory only returned to the instant when Everett had understood that no second message was coming. After leaving the service, he had returned to White Elk and volunteered to care for St. Luke's. At first, it had been a practical task: oil the wheel, inspect the rope, clear snow from the steps. Then the bell became more than maintenance. As long as it still rang, Everett could believe some warnings arrived in time. His eyes moved toward a notice fastened to the wall near the maintenance log. The White Elk Council planned to review the chapel's future after winter. A new digital emergency system was being installed across the valley. If the system passed inspection, the old bell might be declared unnecessary. Unnecessary. Everett disliked the word immediately. It made history sound like clutter. It made service sound temporary. It made 2 engraved names feel easier to remove. Marlow appeared at the top of the stairs despite the command to stay. The dog did not approach the bell. He stopped at the edge of the platform and lowered his head. Everett opened his hand. The bronze fragment lay against his weathered palm. Marlow sniffed once from a distance, then looked at Everett rather than the metal. There was no accusation in the dog's amber eyes. That made the moment harder. Everett had spent years reading Marlow's posture. A lifted chin meant a scent had changed. A lowered tail meant uncertainty, not fear. A still body often meant the dog had noticed something before the people around him. Now Marlow stood with his weight slightly back, as though the danger was not only above them. Everett slipped the fragment into his pocket. "It could be surface damage," he said. Marlow's right ear remained forward. "The sound changed because of the cold." The dog did not move. Everett looked again at the crack. He imagined Lydia arriving with measuring instruments, photographs, caution tape, and the calm professional voice she used when explaining why an old structure had reached the end of its safe life. He imagined the council closing the chapel before the winter festival. He imagined a crane lifting the bell away from the tower. He imagined the empty space afterward. The images came too quickly, each one pretending to be a conclusion. Everett forced himself to breathe slowly. He would limit the bell to light use. He would ask Silas Boone to look at the mechanism. Silas had worked on mine hoists and cable systems for most of his life. He understood old metal better than nearly anyone in White Elk. Lydia's full inspection was already scheduled for later in the season. A few weeks would not matter. The thought sounded reasonable when Everett kept it inside his own head. He returned to the chapel floor with Marlow following behind. At the maintenance desk, Everett opened the inspection log. His pencil hovered above the page. The truthful sentence would have been simple. Visible crack in upper hanging lug. Loose bronze fragment recovered. Bell removed from service pending structural assessment. Everett stared at the blank line. Outside, sunlight moved across the snow. Somewhere in the valley, a truck door closed. A church-shaped shadow stretched from St. Luke's toward the road below. Everett began to write. Unusual tone observed during light test. He stopped. Marlow sat beside the desk. The dog's left front paw rested slightly ahead of the right, the position he often held while waiting for an instruction. Everett continued. Bell may remain in service under restricted pull force. He read the entry twice. Then he added his initials, E.S. The letters looked small on the page. Everett closed the log before he could revise them. He did not record the bronze fragment. He did not photograph the crack. He did not call Lydia. At the chapel door, Everett pulled on his dark green winter coat and wrapped an olive scarf around his neck. Marlow stepped outside first, paws sinking lightly into the fresh snow. The ladder below was bright, clear, and quiet. Everett locked the chapel door, checked the handle once, and started down the hill. After several steps, he realized Marlow was no longer beside him. The German shepherd stood beneath the bell tower, golden stripe bright against his dark face. His head was raised. One ear stood straight, the damaged tip of the other bent toward the cold wind. Everett waited. Marlow continued listening to the tower. Above them, the bell did not move. Yet somewhere inside the old structure, metal gave one faint settling sound. Everett turned toward the road before Marlow did. The dog eventually followed, but not until the sound had completely faded. By mid-morning, White Elk had begun dressing itself for winter. Yellow lights looped beneath the awnings along Main Street. Pine wreaths appeared on doors that had been plain the day before. Outside the general store, two maintenance workers raised a wooden sign announcing the annual Winter Valley Festival, while a county truck pushed fresh snow away from the curb. The sky above Montana was a clear, polished blue. Only the wind suggested that the brightness might not last. It moved down from the northern ridge in brief, searching gusts, lifting loose snow from rooftops and carrying it across the road in silver threads. Most visitors barely noticed. They had come to ski, fish through the ice, and spend a weekend somewhere quiet enough to hear boots pressing into snow. Everett Sloan noticed the wind. He noticed how quickly each gust strengthened, how the powder began collecting along the east-facing walls, and how the flags outside the fire station no longer settled between movements. He also noticed a bronze fragment in the left pocket of his field jacket. It seemed heavier than it had inside the chapel. Marlow walked beside him through the station doors. The German shepherd wore his brick-red rescue harness, the silver reflective strips bright against his black and gold coat. His frost-curved left ear angled toward the voices inside. The main equipment bay had been converted into a temporary command area. Folding tables stood beneath maps of the valley. Portable radios, signal lamps, batteries, laminated route cards, and coils of extension cable had been arranged in labeled groups. At the center of it all stood Nora Vance. She was 55, lean and straight-backed, with ash blonde hair cut to her jaw and pale gray-blue eyes that missed very little. A dark navy emergency jacket covered a gray turtleneck, and a waterproof orange clipboard rested under one arm. Her movements were quick, without appearing hurried. Nora tapped the valley map twice with a red marker. "We are not practicing for a perfect failure," she told the gathered volunteers. "We are practicing for several small failures happening at the same time." Colin Price, seated near the front, raised one hand. Colin was 58, broad through the chest and stomach, with a weather-reddened face and a nose that bent slightly left from an old work accident. His mustard-yellow road maintenance jacket hung open over a dark blue hoodie. "How many failures are we expecting before lunch?" A few people laughed. Nora did not. "Enough that you should have eaten breakfast." That earned a louder response. Everett remained near the back with Marlow. He preferred the edge of rooms where he could see doors, windows, and the people who believed they were not being watched. Nora uncovered the full map. 7 red circles marked locations around White Elk: the fire station, St. Luke's Chapel, the timber mill, the pumping station, Stone Bridge, the mountain lodge, and the upper maintenance depot. "These are our fallback stations," she said. "If the main grid goes down, the fiber line fails, or the Hawthorne repeater loses power, we shift to short-range communication." She pointed from one red circle to the next. "Bell at the chapel, air horn at the mill, signal lamp at the lodge, handheld radios between the pumping station and Stone Bridge. Each station receives, confirms, and passes the instruction forward." Everett folded his arms. The arrangement looked orderly on paper. Storms rarely respected paper. Nora noticed his expression. "Something to add?" "Too many handoffs." The room quieted slightly. Everett stepped closer to the map. "If the valley needs to close a route, the warning should come from one strong point. Every transfer adds delay. Every person repeating a message adds another opportunity to change it." Nora turned the red marker between her fingers. "And one strong point creates one place where the entire warning can fail. The chapel bell reaches most of the valley. Most is not all. It worked before half this equipment existed." Nora held Everett's gaze. "So did kerosene lanterns. We still inspect the wiring." The line was not cruel, but several volunteers looked down to hide smiles. Everett's jaw tightened. Nora touched the marker to the fire station circle. "One signal is no longer enough. Nobody moves until 2 stations answer." The sentence settled over the room. Marlow looked from Nora to Everett, attentive to the change in their voices rather than the meaning of the words. Dana Hargrove broke the silence by clipping a long line to Marlow's rescue harness. She was 49, tall and strongly built, with chestnut-brown hair tied low beneath a burgundy knit cap. Her dark red rescue coat was open at the collar, revealing a black thermal shirt. Amber lens snow goggles rested above her forehead. "We can argue about the end of the world after the scent exercise," Dana said. Everett looked at the line in her hand. "You are taking the eastern course?" "The marked forest loop. The snow drifted overnight near the lower bend. I walked it at 7. The wind has changed since 7. Dana crouched beside Marlow and adjusted the harness strap beneath his chest. "Then Marlow and I will notice." The answer was calm enough to irritate him. Everett followed the search team outside. The training zone began beyond the fire station, where a stand of pines created a shallow, controlled course marked with blue flags. A volunteer had taken a scented cloth and hidden somewhere within the approved boundary. The objective was simple. Dana would guide Marlow through the search while 2 observers tracked their position. Marlow lowered his nose to the cloth. His whole posture changed. The dog who had moved casually through town became still and focused. His breathing deepened. His tail dropped. His left front paw shifted ahead of the right. Dana gave a short hand signal. Marlow moved. Everett followed several yards behind. At the first fork, Marlow angled toward the trees. Dana allowed the line to slide through her gloved hand, then slowed him before a patch of wind-packed snow. "Too much pressure," Everett called. Dana did not turn. "Marlow knows the scent." "The wind is cutting across the trail. Give him room on the downwind side." Dana adjusted by half a step. Marlow circled once and continued. Everett saw the change and felt briefly vindicated. Then Dana lifted one hand without looking back. "Stay outside the course, Everett." "I am outside it." "You are inside his attention." Marlow glanced over his shoulder. Dana stopped. She waited until the dog faced forward again, then gave him the search signal. Everett said nothing for nearly a minute. It was harder than he expected. He knew Marlow's pauses, the difference between uncertainty and distraction, the slight tightening through the dog's shoulders before he committed to a direction. Everett had spent years learning those details. Watching Dana read them correctly felt less like reassurance than displacement. At the second bend, Marlow left the marked path and moved toward a fallen pine. Dana did not correct him. She followed at a safe angle, keeping the line clear of branches. Marlow stopped beside a snow-covered equipment shed and barked once. The hidden volunteer opened the door. Several observers applauded. Dana knelt and rewarded Marlow with a short length of braided rope. The dog took it, shook it once, then sat beside her. Everett waited for Marlow to return. He did not. Not until Dana removed the search command, unclipped the long line, and touched 2 fingers to her chest. Only then did Marlow cross the snow and stand beside Everett. The dog had not chosen Dana over him. Marlow had simply finished one responsibility before returning to another. Everett knew the distinction. He still disliked how much it mattered. "Good search," Colin said as he approached. Everett looked toward the flags. The course was controlled. Colin pulled off one glove and opened his steel thermos. "Controlled is what training is for. A marked forest in daylight does not prove the network works in a real storm." Colin took a drink. "Nothing proves anything to you unless you are the one holding the rope." Dana stood several feet away, checking Marlow's paws for packed snow. She did not interrupt. Everett's voice became quieter. "Procedures cannot see wind change. They cannot feel when a road is about to disappear." "No," Colin replied. "People do that. More than one person usually." For a moment, neither man spoke. Colin was not an enemy. He had cleared roads beside Everett for 11 winters. They had shared coffee and stalled trucks, repaired chains in blowing snow, and carried equipment together when machines could go no farther. That history made the disagreement less comfortable, not more. Nora called the group back inside before either man could continue. The rest of the drill tested message transfer through the 7 stations. Some signals arrived quickly, others did not. The timber mill repeated the wrong route number once. Stonebridge missed a lamp flash because a truck blocked the line of sight. A handheld radio battery failed at the pumping station. Each error strengthened Everett's argument. Each successful correction strengthened Nora's. By late afternoon, the sky had lost its polished blue. A pale layer of cloud spread from the north, flattening the light across the valley. Everett left the station before the final discussion. He told himself he needed to check St. Luke's signal rope. In truth, he wanted to hear the bell again. Silas Boone was already at the chapel when Everett arrived. The retired mine mechanic stood beside the lower pulley box wearing faded blue-gray coveralls beneath a copper-brown canvas coat. He was shorter than Everett and thick through the shoulders, with a silver mustache and large hands shaped by decades of tools. Reading glasses hung from a cord around his neck. Silas pulled the rope a few inches, listening to the wheel above. "Do it again," he said. Everett gave the rope a controlled, shallow pull. The bell sounded once. Its note was low and uneven. Silas looked toward the tower ceiling. That is not ice. The temperature changed. Temperature changes pitch. It does not put a scrape behind the strike. Silas opened the pulley box and inspected the lower mechanism. Let me see the upper mount. Lydia is coming after the festival. Silas glanced at him. Lydia coming later does not make the metal stronger today. Everett placed one hand on the rope. It is not under a full operating load. That was not my question. Outside, wind pushed loose snow against the chapel wall. Marlow stood near the altar, watching both men. Silas wiped his hands on a cloth. I can come back with a light and a mirror. We inspect the hanging assembly, document what we find, and close the bell if it needs closing. You are treating an unusual tone like a structural failure. I am treating an unusual tone like something worth looking at. Everett looked toward the narrow brass plaque beside the altar. Daniel Mercer, Owen Rusk. Silas followed his gaze but said nothing about the names. That restraint made Everett defensive. The inspection is already scheduled. Silas put on his gloves. Then you have made your decision. It is not a decision, it is the existing schedule. Silas gave him a long look. Schedules do not hide things, Everett. People do. He left without another word. By evening, the first skin of ice had formed along the power lines. Everett watched it from the cabin window. Marlow lay near the stove, but the dog's ears moved each time the wind pressed against the glass. The two bronze fragments were now in Everett's field jacket pocket. He had taken the first from the tower that morning and found the second only after returning to the chapel alone after dark. He had told himself he was making one final test. Marlow had followed him up the hill and stopped at the same staircase. Again, the dog placed one paw on Everett's boot. Again, Everett ordered him aside. The bell moved only a few inches before a sharp metallic scrape came from above. A second bronze fragment struck the wooden platform. Everett picked it up. This time he did not climb to inspect the crack. He already knew what he would find. Standing beneath the silent bell, he decided that he would close the tower at first light. He would call Lydia, tell Nora, and find a way to argue that the bell could still be repaired rather than removed. One night would not change anything. Back at the cabin, Everett placed his field jacket over a chair. The two fragments touched inside the pocket with a faint click. Marlow raised his head. Everett looked toward the dark window. A hard grain of ice struck the glass, then another. Across the valley, the power lines began to hum. The storm reached White Elk before dawn. It did not arrive as a single wall of snow. It came in layers. Freezing rain against windows, wind moving through the pines, then a hard white blur that erased the eastern ridge one section at a time. At 4:18 in the morning, a mature pine gave way above the western utility corridor. The falling trunk struck the power lines first. A moment later, the fiber cable running through the same service route snapped beneath the weight of ice and branches. Lights disappeared across half the valley. Internet service failed with them. On Hawthorne Pass, ice coated the emergency radio repeater until its signal weakened to a narrow, unreliable reach. Mobile phones still connected in several low areas, but calls dropped without warning. Handheld radios worked in direct mode, though only across short distances. By 5, the White Elk fire station glowed on generator power. Nora Vance stood at the center table in her Navy emergency jacket, one hand resting on the waterproof orange clipboard. A battery lamp threw a clean circle of light over the valley map. Around her, volunteers moved equipment into place, checked route cards, and tested radios that answered with bursts of static. Nora did not raise her voice. From this moment, all movement is logged. No vehicle changes route without confirmation. No station assumes silence means approval. She marked 3 positions on the map. 11 heating maintenance workers remained at the mountain lodge. 2 drivers with a fuel tanker were waiting on the eastern route. Colin Price and 2 county road workers were operating a snowplow to keep the emergency corridor open. Dana Hargrove stood near the open equipment bay, securing gear inside the snowcat. Her burgundy rescue coat was zipped to the throat, and amber lenses rested over her eyes. Marlow waited beside her in his brick-red harness, calm but alert, his curved left ear angled toward the wind pressing against the station doors. Silas Boone had already been sent to Stonebridge with a portable radio and one of the old mine bells. Everett remained beside the map table. His faded field jacket was still damp from the walk uphill. The two bronze fragments in his pocket touched whenever he moved. He had planned to close the bell at first light. First light had come without asking permission. Nora pointed to him. "You handle the traditional signal sequence from St. Luke's. You report every response here. You do not improvise." Everett held her gaze. "Understood." The word came easily. The truth behind it did not. A county truck carried Everett and Marlow up the Chapel Road. Snow already covered the tire marks made less than an hour before. From the hill, White Elk appeared in pieces, a row of yellow windows, the blue-white sweep of the mill's yard light, the dark line of the river, and the red pulse of an emergency lamp near the fire station. The chapel itself stood pale against the storm. Inside, the air smelled of stone, old wood, and cold metal. Everett removed his gloves and opened the signal card Nora had issued. The bell would not carry every message. It was only one part of the network, reinforced by lamps, horns, and radios. Still, from the northern hill its sound could reach the mill, the lodge road, and stone bridge when the wind allowed. He placed one hand on the rope. Marlow stood several feet away. The dog did not block him this time. That troubled Everett more than resistance would have. The first instruction came through the handheld radio. "St. Luke's, command. Initiate emergency mode. One long signal. Await confirmation." Everett pulled with controlled force. The bell moved. Its note rolled over the valley, lower than it should have been, but strong enough to reach beyond the chapel walls. The sound faded into snow and distance. For several seconds nothing answered. Then a horn sounded from the timber mill. A white lamp flashed twice from the mountain lodge. Stonebridge confirmed by radio. The system had heard him. Everett logged the time. The second instruction arrived 15 minutes later. North route closure, 2 measured signals. Everett looked up into the tower. The rope hung still. He pulled once, waited the required interval, then pulled again. The bell answered with 2 uneven notes. The second carried a scrape beneath it, so faint that the radio operator at command could not have heard. Marlow heard it. The German shepherd's head lifted sharply. His front left paw shifted ahead of the other, and his weight moved backward. Everett released the rope. A horn answered from the mill. Stonebridge confirmed. A light blinked at the lodge. On the map below, the northern route was now closed. For a brief moment, the old bell and Nora's new network worked together exactly as they were meant to. Everett felt a dangerous kind of relief. Perhaps the crack had stabilized. Perhaps the fragments represented old damage finally working loose. Perhaps he had not risked anything that could not be managed. The radio interrupted the thought. Dana's voice arrived beneath wind and engine noise. "Command, Search 1. Wind has shifted east-northeast. Heavy drifting starting across East Service Road. Visibility dropping fast." Nora answered immediately. "Copy. Hold your position." Everett reached for the route map. East Service Road was the same corridor Colin was keeping open. The last instruction sent to Colin allowed him to continue toward the upper junction before turning back. If the wind had shifted, that instruction was no longer safe. The radio clicked again. "St. Luke's, prepare cancellation signal. 3 short intervals. East route units return to previous checkpoint." Everett wrapped his hand around the rope. Marlow stood very still. "Command, St. Luke's, preparing 3. Everett pulled. The bell began to move. Above him, something shifted with a deep metallic strain. The first note never formed. A harsh scrape cut through the tower. The rope jerked sideways, burning across Everett's glove, then stopped as if tied to the stone itself. Dust fell from the ceiling. Marlow barked once. Everett looked up. The bell had tilted toward the western beam. The corroded steel pin had slipped from its seated position, and the cracked hanging lug had opened under the movement. The clapper lodged against the inner wall. Everett pulled the rope again. Nothing. Not silence exactly. The tower held the trapped weight of a sound that could no longer escape. His radio came alive. "St. Luke's, command, no signal received. Repeat, no signal received." Everett tried once more, using less force. The rope remained locked. "Bell failure," he said. "Mechanical obstruction, unable to transmit." Nora's reply came without hesitation. "All stations, cancellation message by direct relay. East route units return immediately. Confirm Collins' position." Static answered. Dana called from the lower road. "Search 1 to Road 3. Colin, copy?" No response. The fire station operator tried the mobile number assigned to the snowplow. The call connected for less than 2 seconds, then dropped. At Stonebridge, Silas rang the small mine bell, sending the cancellation toward the eastern corridor. The mill added its horn. A volunteer at the pumping station attempted to relay by handheld radio, but each alternate route took time. Time was the one thing the original signal had been designed to save. A broken transmission finally came from Colin. "Road 3, east marker, continuing to upper—" Static swallowed the rest. Nora cut in. "Road 3, cancel movement. Return to checkpoint 2. Confirm." Nothing answered. Everett stood beneath the silent bell, with one hand still around the useless rope. He could see the sequence clearly. Colin had received the earlier order. Colin had not received the cancellation. A few minutes later, the mountain lodge reported that drifting snow had crossed the eastern road entirely. Dana's team attempted to raise Colin again. At 5:57, one short transmission reached command. "Road 3 stopped, snow ahead and behind, 3 aboard, no injuries, heater weak." Then the connection failed. Everett closed his eyes for a single breath. He had spent years telling himself that disaster came from complex chains, weather, distance, timing, and imperfect systems. This chain had a simpler link. He had seen the crack. He had kept the bell in service. Silas arrived at the chapel in a county utility truck. He entered carrying a flashlight and a tool bag, snow frozen into his silver mustache. "Do not touch the rope," he said. Everett stepped away. Silas inspected the lower line, then walked outside to view the tower through binoculars. A few minutes later, he returned and crouched near the base of the stairs. Something lay among the dust. Silas picked up a fresh sliver of bronze. He held it beneath the flashlight. "First piece?" Everett did not answer. Silas looked at Everett's jacket pocket. The old mechanic's expression changed, not to anger, but recognition. "That is what I thought." By the time they returned to the fire station, Nora had reorganized the command board. Dana was preparing a search route toward Colin's last confirmed position. Marlow waited beside the snowcat, snow melting along the edges of his harness. Nora extended one hand toward Everett. "The inspection log." He gave it to her. She read the entry from the previous morning. Unusual tone observed during light test. Bell may remain in service under restricted pull force. Nora looked up. "Did you inspect the upper assembly?" "Yes." "What did you find?" Everett reached into his pocket. He placed the first bronze fragment on the table, then the second. The room did not become silent all at once. Radios continued speaking, boots crossed the concrete floor, someone closed a metal cabinet. But the people nearest the table stopped moving. Nora looked at the fragments, then at Everett. "You had these before this morning?" "Yes." "How long?" "The first since yesterday morning, the second since last night." Dana stood beside Marlow near the equipment bay. Her face showed no surprise, only a hard disappointment. Nora closed the log. "You are relieved from signal operations." Everett's throat tightened. "I know the terrain east of—" "You are relieved from signal operations," Nora repeated. "Your maps stay, your route knowledge stays, your authority to transmit does not." She handed the radio assignment to another operator. Everett stepped outside. The storm had turned the parking lot into a white, moving surface. He removed his volunteer badge and placed it beside the keys on the hood of the maintenance truck. For one weak moment, he considered walking home. There would be no explanation waiting there, no eyes on him, no bronze pieces on a table beneath emergency lights. Marlow followed him halfway across the lot. Everett reached for the driver's door. The dog stopped. Marlow turned toward the fire station, where Dana was loading rescue blankets into the snowcat. He did not pull toward Everett. He did not whine. He simply remained facing the people who still had work to do. Everett looked at the dog for several seconds, then he picked up the keys and badge. Back inside, he placed the valley maps, maintenance records, and both fragments in front of Nora. "I delayed the report," he said. "I thought the bell would be removed if the damage looked serious. I convinced myself restricted use was enough." No one interrupted. "I was wrong." Nora pointed to an empty chair at the map table. "You will identify terrain hazards and answer questions. Every recommendation goes through me. You issue no orders." Everett sat down. Marlow entered with Dana and settled several feet away. The dog remained close enough to see him, but Marlow did not place his head on Everett's knee. That small distance held everything Everett had failed to say before the bell went silent. The 7-station network came alive, one piece at a time. At Stonebridge, Silas Boone hung an old mine bell beneath the covered maintenance shelter and tested it with a short iron striker. The note was smaller than the voice of St. Luke's, but clean enough to travel along the frozen river. At the timber mill, 2 workers rolled an air horn to the open loading bay. The mountain lodge aimed a high-powered signal lamp toward the valley. Volunteers at the pumping station and upper maintenance depot tested their handheld radios in direct mode. None of the stations could reach everyone. Together, they could pass a message across White Elk. Nora stood over the command map at the fire station, marking each confirmed connection with a red line. Stonebridge? A short bell sequence came through a radio held near the shelter. Confirmed. Mill? The air horn sounded in the distance. Confirmed. Lodge? A volunteer at the eastern window watched through binoculars. 2 white flashes. Confirmed. Nora drew the final line. "No vehicle moves on one report," she said. "No route change is valid until a second station confirms it." Everett sat at the end of the map table. The position felt smaller than it had an hour earlier. His route charts remained useful. His knowledge of the valley remained useful, but the radio no longer rested in his hand. Every recommendation he made had to pass through Nora before anyone outside the station could act on it. Dana approached in her burgundy rescue coat. Snow had collected along the shoulders, and her amber-lensed goggles were pulled down over her eyes. Behind her, 2 adult volunteers loaded blankets, a medical pack, recovery boards, and a portable heater into the snowcat. Marlow stood at Dana's side in his brick-red harness. The dog looked ready. Everett stood. "You are taking the South Ridge approach?" "Until the pumping station confirms the eastern drift line. You will lose time near the timber cut. We will lose more if we enter the road without knowing where the snow settled." Everett looked at Marlow. "He works differently in heavy wind." "I know. He may leave the vehicle track if the exhaust scent is pushed down slope." "I know that too." Dana's voice remained level. She was not challenging him for the pleasure of winning. That made the disagreement harder. Everett reached for Marlow's leash. Dana did not release it. Nora looked up from the map. "Dana is the secondary certified handler. That does not mean she knows every change in him." "No," Nora said. "It means she knows enough to lead this search." Everett's eyes moved toward the storm beyond the equipment bay. Somewhere behind that moving white wall, Colin and 2 road workers were sitting inside a snowplow with a weakening heater. "Marlow has always worked with me." Nora set down her red marker. "And believing only you could do the work is part of what brought us here." No one spoke. Dana stepped closer, but she did not pull the leash from Everett's hand. Instead, she opened her gloved palm and waited. Marlow looked up at Everett. The dog's right ear stood straight. The damaged tip of his left ear curved toward the sound of the idling snowcat. His body remained angled toward the open bay, but he did not move. Everett realized Marlow was waiting for a command. Not permission to leave him, permission to work. Everett loosened his grip. He placed the leash in Dana's hand. "Watch the lower cut," he said. "The wind rolls back there." Dana closed her fingers around the line. "I will." She turned toward the vehicle. Marlow stepped with her when she gave the working signal. Before climbing into the rear compartment, the dog looked back once. Everett gave a small downward motion with his hand, the release they had used for years. Marlow entered the snowcat. The bay door lifted and the rescue vehicle moved into the storm. Everett returned to the map table. For the next 20 minutes, information arrived in fragments. The pumping station reported drifting across the lower eastern road. Stonebridge heard an engine but could not see it. The lodge signal operator saw nothing beyond the first switchback. Dana's voice came through beneath engine noise. "Search 1 at the south ridge marker, visibility approximately 40 yards, beginning track search." Nora repeated the coordinates and logged the time. Everett leaned over the map. The plow would have crossed marker 12 before the cancellation attempt. Colin usually keeps the blade angled right near the drainage curve. Nora looked at him. "Recommendation? Search west of the center line. The blade would push the rear wheels toward the shoulder." Nora sent the suggestion to Dana without presenting it as an order. Several minutes passed. "Search 1 to command. Partial tread pattern located west shoulder." Everett's hand tightened around the edge of the table. Dana continued. "Marlow has vehicle odor, proceeding on foot for 30 yards. The radio went quiet. Everett pictured the terrain without needing the map. A shallow rise, 2 wind-bent pines, a drainage ditch hidden beneath new snow. He knew how easily a searcher could mistake the smooth white surface for solid ground. He reached toward the spare radio. Nora covered it with one hand. "Wait. There is a ditch north of the track. Dana has the hazard card. The card does not show how the drift curls around it." Nora did not remove her hand. "Then tell me, I will relay it." Everett gave her the details. Nora repeated them. Dana acknowledged. The system felt painfully slow. It was also still working. A bark came faintly through Dana's radio. Then her voice sharpened. "Visual on snowplow, vehicle stationary in drift pocket, 3 occupants visible." The command room released a breath it had been holding together. Nora did not celebrate. "Condition? Assessing." Inside the snowcat, Dana and the 2 volunteers secured themselves before crossing the final stretch. Marlow moved ahead on a long line, nose low to the snow. The plow's roof and upper windows rose from a hollow filled by drifting powder. Colin pushed open the driver's door only a few inches before packed snow stopped it. Dana reached the passenger side, cleared enough space, and climbed onto the step. "Everyone awake?" Colin's broad face appeared behind fogged glass. "Awake and offended." The joke lacked its usual strength. One of the men beside him moved slowly, blinking as though the light bothered him. The cabin heater was still running, but the air carried a heavy exhaust smell. Dana opened the passenger window farther. "Engine off." "If I shut it down, we lose heat." "Engine off now." Colin obeyed. Marlow had moved toward the rear of the plow. He stopped beside the buried exhaust area and repeatedly lifted his muzzle, testing the air. Then he turned his head toward Dana and gave a short, controlled bark. Dana climbed down and followed the line. The exhaust pipe had disappeared beneath packed snow. Fumes had nowhere to escape cleanly and were collecting around the vehicle. She radioed command. "Blocked exhaust. 1 occupant showing possible exposure symptoms, beginning ventilation and extraction." Everett closed his eyes for half a second. Marlow had not diagnosed anything. He had followed the strongest concentration of an unusual scent and alerted his handler. Dana had understood what the behavior meant. The distinction mattered. So did the result. The rescue team cleared the doors, opened the cabin, and moved the 3 men into fresh air. The slowest worker was wrapped in an insulated blanket and placed inside the snowcat under observation. At Dana's command, Marlow lay beside him, his warm body pressed along the man's legs, while a volunteer checked his breathing and responsiveness. Colin stood outside the plow, one glove pressed against the roof. "I should have turned back." "You followed the last confirmed route order," Dana said. "The cancellation never reached you." Colin's eyes moved toward the radio on her shoulder. "Why not?" Dana did not answer for Everett. "The bell failed." Colin looked away toward the white hillside. He did not ask another question. While one volunteer gathered equipment from the plow, Colin removed a folded maintenance map from a waterproof sleeve behind the driver's seat. "I received a partial call before the signal disappeared," he said. "Ruth Delgado at the Veterans Recovery Center. Their generator fuel system was acting up. She wanted to know whether the tanker could still reach them." Dana took the map. A hand-drawn line marked an older service route passing below St. Luke's Hill. "This road still open?" "It was last week, lower grade than the main approach, narrow near the chapel embankment." Dana photographed the map and transmitted it to command. The image appeared on Nora's tablet in sections. Everett recognized the line immediately. "Old maintenance loop," he said, "used before the northern road was widened." Nora studied the route. "Can a fuel sled take it?" "If the chapel-side embankment holds." She looked at him. Everett understood the question beneath the question. The damaged bell hung directly above that road. Before anyone could discuss it further, Dana reported that the rescued men were ready to move. The return journey began slowly. The snowcat carried the worker who had shown the strongest symptoms, while Colin and the 3rd man rode in the recovery vehicle behind it. At the fire station, reports showed the wind shifting again. Everett studied the way snow moved across the exterior lights. It no longer traveled directly east. It curled southeast in low sheets. "The old route back will fill beneath the ridge," he said. "Send them through Stonebridge." Nora lifted the radio, then stopped. "What confirms it?" Everett stared at the map. In the past, that question would have sounded like doubt. Now he heard its actual meaning. "What do we have at the mill?" "Visibility poor, wind gauge still functioning." "Ask for direction and sustained speed, then have Silas check the river flags at Stonebridge." Nora relayed both requests. The mill responded first, wind east-northeast increasing. At Stonebridge, Silas stepped from beneath the shelter long enough to observe the fabric markers along the frozen river. He returned to the radio. "Wind has turned across the old road, snow building against the ridge face." 2 reports, the same warning. Nora authorized the Stonebridge route. Dana acknowledged and redirected the team. 10 minutes later, the lodge signal operator reported movement on the abandoned return path. A shallow layer of wet, heavy snow slid down the lower slope and spread across the road. It was not a major avalanche, but it covered the tracks deeply enough to stop a vehicle. The route Dana had left behind disappeared. Everett looked at the 2 confirmation marks Nora had drawn on the map. His first instinct had been correct. That no longer seemed like the important part. The important part was that other people had seen it too. The snowcat returned to the fire station shortly before noon. Dana entered first. Colin followed, pale with fatigue but walking under his own strength. The 3rd worker remained under medical observation, alert and speaking. Marlow jumped down from the rear compartment. He did not run directly to Everett. The dog waited until Dana removed the working command and unclipped the line. Then he crossed the bay and stood in front of Everett. Snow clung to his chest and the fur around his legs. Everett lowered one hand. Marlow pressed his muzzle briefly into the palm. Dana approached carrying Colin's maintenance map. "We found them because everyone did one part," she said. Everett looked at the leash in her hand. "I know." It was the first time he had said those words without meaning that he already knew better. On the command table, the newly discovered service route passed beneath St. Luke's Chapel and continued toward the Veterans Recovery Center. The first rescue had ended, but it had returned with a map pointing toward another group of people waiting in the cold. Everett looked at the route, then at the 7 confirmed stations surrounding it. This time, he did not reach for the radio. He waited for Nora to speak. The map from Colin's snowplow was still damp when Ruth Delgado's voice came through the fire station radio. "Command, this is White Elk Veterans Recovery Center. We have a fuel feed problem." Nora Vance turned toward the communications table. "Go ahead, Ruth." Static moved across the speaker before the answer arrived. "The generator is running from the auxiliary tank, but the main diesel line is not feeding properly. Maintenance believes the fuel has begun to wax in the cold. The filter is nearly blocked." "How long do you have?" A pause followed. 3 hours if the load stays low, less if the temperature drops again." The fire station seemed to grow quieter around the words. Outside, the storm continued to erase the town in shifting layers of white. The digital thermometer beside the equipment bay showed the temperature falling another 2 degrees. Wind pressed snow into the bottom of the doors and rattled the metal siding. Nora moved to the command map. Everett remained at the far end of the table where Colin's old maintenance chart lay beside the newer county maps. Dana stood near the medical area, while one of the rescued road workers was examined. Marlow rested at her feet, though his ears remained alert. Ruth's voice returned. "We have 6 staff members and 9 residents in the building. Everyone is stable. We have moved them into the West Common Room and closed the unused wings." Everett knew the recovery center. It stood beyond the Northern Grove in a converted stone lodge built long before the modern road reached that side of the valley. The place served veterans recovering from surgery, exhaustion, and the quiet injuries that often followed people home long after uniforms had been put away. Nora asked, "Any equipment that cannot lose power?" "Nothing requiring continuous life support," Ruth said. "But we need heat, lights, refrigeration for medication, and enough power to keep the communication station working." A second voice sounded faintly behind her. "Tell them to move the others first." Ruth did not cover the radio. "Walter, sit down." "I am sitting." "Then do it more quietly." Despite the tension, Dana's mouth moved toward a smile. Nora pressed the transmit button. "Ruth, who is Walter?" "Walter Keene, 71, former Army medic, recovering from hip surgery and currently convinced that age makes him a transportation plan." The man's voice came again, closer this time. "I said I can remain until the last group." Ruth answered him before Nora could. "No one stays alone because he once wore a uniform." The line went silent for a moment. Then Walter said, more softly, "Understood." Ruth Delgado had worked night shifts at the center for nearly 18 years. She was 64, small in stature, with silver curls, warm brown skin, and red-framed reading glasses that usually rested low on her nose. People often mistook her calm voice for gentleness until they tried to argue with a safety instruction. Nora studied the command board. "We need fuel and a replacement filter." "The tanker is still held on the eastern road," one operator said. "But we have sealed winter diesel drums at the county depot." "How much?" "Enough to extend generator operation through evacuation." Everett looked at Colin's map. The old service route curved beneath St. Luke's Hill, past the chapel embankment, and continued through the Northern Grove toward the recovery center. It was narrower than the main road, but had a gentler grade. Nora followed his gaze. "The primary approach is blocked?" Dana nodded. "Too much drift accumulation near the upper bend. A snowcat could possibly cross, but not with a low-fuel sled." Everett traced the old route with one finger. "This road was used before the North Highway was widened. It stays below the open ridge, so wind loading is lower." Colin stood nearby with a blanket around his shoulders. Fatigue had drained some color from his broad face, but his voice remained steady. "The surface was solid last week, narrow under the chapel, though." How narrow? Nora asked. Enough for the sled, not enough if stone or timber comes down from above. Everyone looked toward the northern mark on the map, St. Luke's Chapel. The damaged bell still hung inside the tower. Nora called Silas at the chapel. His response came beneath the faint ringing of the small mine bell at Stonebridge, where a volunteer had temporarily taken over his signal post. "I am outside the lower wall," Silas reported. "The bell is shifting whenever the wind hits from the west." "Can you see the support?" "Not clearly from ground level, but I can hear the frame taking load." Everett's shoulders tightened. Nora noticed. "Explain." "The bell is no longer centered," Everett said. "If it swings against the west beam, the impact transfers into the upper frame." "Could the tower fall?" "Not the entire tower," he said, "but part of the timber assembly could break loose." "And the road sits below it?" "Yes." Nora looked at the satellite terminal. "Get Lydia Mercer." The connection took nearly 8 minutes. During that time, the station divided the available fuel into sealed containers, loaded a replacement filter, checked the towing frame, and prepared 2 snowmobiles to escort the low sled. Dana began assigning drivers and safety positions. Everett did not volunteer to lead. He remained at the map. That restraint felt unnatural enough to require effort. The satellite screen finally displayed Lydia Mercer in the county engineering office 40 miles away. The image froze twice before settling. Lydia was 57, with short salt and pepper curls, a long, thoughtful face, and thin, bronze-framed glasses. A yellow pencil rested behind her right ear. Behind her, rolled drawings and inspection folders covered a wall of metal shelving. Nora explained the situation. Silas transmitted photographs of the chapel exterior. Everett supplied the bell's estimated weight, the location of the cracked hanging lug, and the amount of visible movement from the morning inspection. Lydia listened without interrupting. "Send the restoration drawings," she said. An operator scanned the old plans from the chapel file. The connection moved slowly, each page appearing on Lydia's screen line by line. Everett watched the drawings arrive. He had seen them before, but never under these conditions. The bell chamber had been reinforced during a restoration in the 1970s. A maintenance winch had been installed outside the main load zone so the bell could be lowered onto a timber cradle for repairs. Lydia enlarged one section. "The tower itself is probably not at immediate risk," she said. "The problem is dynamic loading. The bell is hanging off-center. Every gust is making that weight strike or pull against a frame not designed for repeated lateral impact." Silas asked, "Can we secure it in place?" "Not safely without entering the load path." "What about the old winch?" Lydia studied the plan. "If the cable and anchor points are still serviceable, you may be able to transfer the load and lower the bell onto the maintenance cradle." Everett looked toward the dark northern window. "May?" "The drawings are 50 years old," Lydia replied. "I am not standing beneath the structure, and neither should anyone else." Nora leaned closer to the screen. "What would the operation require?" "Silas inspects the external winch, cable, and anchor points. No one enters the bell chamber. Dana establishes a safety perimeter. I approve each stage from the photographs and measurements you send." "And if the hanging lug fails while the bell is being lowered?" Lydia did not soften the answer. "The bell may drop the final distance onto the cradle. The body may crack. The crown assembly may separate completely." Everett felt the words more sharply than he expected. The station continued moving around him. Containers were strapped to the sled. Radios were checked. Someone brought in a tray of coffee and left it untouched. On the satellite screen, Lydia looked directly toward the camera. "If the bell remains where it is, each wind gust increases the chance of uncontrolled failure. If part of the frame comes down the embankment, the service road could become unusable." "How long before you expect that?" Nora asked. "I cannot give you a reliable time." At the recovery center, Ruth checked in again. "The West Common Room is holding at 58 degrees, she said. "Auxiliary fuel is below half." A man coughed in the background. Ruth lowered her voice. "Walter is asking whether the route is open." Nora looked toward Everett. "Not yet." Walter's voice came faintly over the connection. "Then use the fuel for the others." Ruth answered immediately. "There are no others, Walter. There is only everyone." The sentence seemed to cross the entire valley. Everett stared at the maintenance route beneath St. Luke's. For years he had treated duty as a line drawn around whatever he could personally protect. The bell, the chapel, Marlow, the old names engraved beside the altar. He had believed that if he guarded those things closely enough, the past could not be taken from him again. Now 15 people were sitting in a cooling building while the object he had protected threatened the only practical road leading to them. Nora stepped away from the satellite terminal and spoke quietly enough that only Everett, Dana, and Silas could hear. "We can attempt the main road with the snowcat and carry smaller fuel loads." Dana shook her head. "The first vehicle might cross, the sled will not. We would need several trips, and the ridge is still loading with snow." "We could wait for the wind to ease." "No forecast says it will." Silas removed one glove and rubbed his stiff fingers. "The winch may work." "May," Everett repeated. Silas looked at him. That is the word honest men use when metal has not promised them anything. Everett did not take offense. He no longer had the right to. Nora asked, "Is there another route?" Everett checked every line on the map, though he already knew the answer. The river crossing was too narrow for the fuel sled. The western forestry path climbed through open terrain. The main northern road was blocked by drift buildup. The service road below St. Luke's was the only route with both sufficient width and a manageable grade. "No," he said. Nora returned to the satellite screen. "Lydia, prepare the lowering procedure." Everett looked at her. Nora did not mistake his silence for agreement. "This is your chapel," she said, "but this is not your decision alone." "I know. You need to say what you know about the mechanism. Nothing less, nothing more." Everett nodded. They drove to St. Luke's in 3 vehicles. The chapel rose above the white valley, its stone walls bright beneath the emergency lamps. Wind swept snow across the hilltop, revealing and covering the lower steps in alternating waves. Dana established the perimeter using reflective stakes and rope. No one was allowed beneath the tower wall or along the exposed section of road. Silas inspected the external winch from a sheltered position, measuring the cable and photographing each anchor point for Lydia. Marlow remained beside Nora outside the restricted area. The dog's brick-red harness stood out against the snow. His ears tracked every metallic creak from the tower, but he did not pull toward the chapel. Everett stood near the gate. Through the open doorway, he could see the brass plaque beside the altar. Daniel Mercer, Owen Rusk. For years, Everett had imagined that preserving the bell meant preserving the promise made to them. But the men he remembered had not believed in monuments more than people. They had trusted signals because signals were supposed to bring someone home. A gust struck the tower. The bell shifted inside with a low, heavy knock. Silas looked up. "That movement is getting worse." Lydia's voice came through Nora's radio. "The winch and primary anchor appear serviceable. I recommend proceeding before conditions deteriorate further." Nora turned to Everett. She did not ask for permission. She asked for truth. "Can the road be used while that bell remains unsecured?" Everett looked down the hill. 2 snowmobiles waited beside the loaded fuel sled. Beyond them, hidden by the northern grove and the blowing snow, Ruth Delgado was keeping 15 adults together in one shrinking pocket of warmth. Marlow watched Everett. Then the dog turned his head toward the waiting vehicles. The movement was small and natural. Marlow did not understand memorials, engineering drawings, or the cost of letting an object go. He understood where people were waiting. Everett faced Nora. "Lower it." The words left him without ceremony. No bell rang, no one applauded. Nora raised the radio and authorized the operation. Everett remained outside the safety line, looking at the tower while the wind carried snow through the valley. For the first time since he had returned to White Elk, keeping his promise did not mean preserving the bell. It meant allowing it to come down. The first strain entered the winch cable without sound. Silas Boone watched the line tighten beneath the shelter beside St. Luke's Chapel. His gloved hands rested on the control lever, but he did not move it farther until Lydia Mercer confirmed the reading from the photographs and measurements sent through the satellite terminal. "Hold at 10% load," Lydia's voice said through Nora's radio. "Check both anchors again." Silas crouched behind the timber barrier and studied the two steel anchor points through his reading glasses. Snow moved sideways across the hill, collecting along the edges of his faded coveralls. "Primary anchor is steady," he reported. "Secondary has no visible movement." Dana walked the safety perimeter one final time. Reflective stakes marked the boundary around the chapel, the embankment, and the service road below. Every volunteer stood outside the possible fall zone. No one was beneath the bell. Marlow remained beside Nora behind the barrier. His brick-red harness stood out against the white ground. The German shepherd's head was raised toward the tower, but his body remained calm. Everett stood several yards away. Through the open chapel door, he could see the lower portion of the bell hanging above the reinforced maintenance cradle. The bronze body leaned toward the western support beam. Each gust caused a faint movement through the timber frame. Silas increased the winch load. The cable gave a low, metallic hum. Inside the tower, the bell shifted by less than an inch. A dry crack answered. Everett stepped forward before he realized he had moved. Nora raised one hand. "Stay behind the line." "I can help Silas read the movement." "Lydia is reading it. Silas is operating the winch." "I know that mechanism." "And you are not the person assigned to it." Everett looked toward the bell. The urge to cross the boundary was almost physical. Every habit in him insisted that responsibility meant moving closer, placing his own hands on the problem and accepting whatever followed. But responsibility had already been divided. Lydia evaluated the structure. Silas controlled the machinery. Dana protected the work zone. Nora commanded the operation. Everett's role was to provide information and remain where he had been told. He forced his feet to stay still. Silas eased the lever forward. The winch drew the bell away from the western beam. The movement was slow enough to seem harmless, yet each fraction of an inch transferred weight through metal that had already begun to fail. "Cable load rising evenly," Silas said. Lydia replied, "Continue at minimum speed." The bell descended. Everett could see the old bronze catching the emergency lights. For years, that surface had carried sound across White Elk. It had called men from warm houses and sent vehicles onto frozen roads. It had become part of the way Everett understood duty. Now the bell moved downward without ringing. The silence felt more final than any toll. A gust struck the tower. The timber frame shuddered. Marlow rose. The winch cable tightened sharply and a brittle sound came from the cracked, hanging lug. Silas stopped the mechanism. "Movement at the crown." "Hold," Lydia ordered. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then a narrow fragment of bronze fell onto the wooden cradle below. Everett's hand closed around the empty air beside his coat pocket, where the first two fragments had once been hidden. Dana looked toward him but said nothing. Lydia studied the newest image sent from the inspection camera. "The lug is separating," she said. "The cradle is less than 2 feet below the bell. Continue lowering. Do not attempt to raise it again." Silas drew a slow breath. "Understood." The winch resumed. The bell descended another 6 inches. Another crack traveled through the chamber. This one was deeper. Everett saw the upper fitting twist. The bronze around the hanging point opened along the existing fracture. For a moment, the bell remained supported by the winch and one narrow section of metal. Then the hanging lug separated. The bell dropped the final distance. It struck the reinforced cradle with a heavy, contained impact. The timber platform compressed beneath the weight. Bronze split along two old casting lines, and the bell settled into three large sections surrounded by dust and small fragments. The tower remained standing. The winch cable went slack. No one moved until Lydia spoke. "Confirm the frame." Silas examined the exterior reference marks. No additional shift. Dana walked the boundary and checked the embankment. "Road remains clear." Only then did Nora lower her radio. "The hazard is contained." No one cheered. The wind passed through the empty bell chamber, producing a low breath between the wooden louvers. Everett stared through the chapel doorway. The bell was no longer a bell. It was three pieces of old bronze resting on timber. He thought of entering the chapel, kneeling beside the fragments and finding the section closest to the engraved plaque. He imagined carrying one piece home before someone else could label it, move it, or decide what it should become. He did none of those things. When Dana opened the safety perimeter, Marlow crossed the snow toward him. The dog pressed one shoulder against Everett's leg. Everett placed a hand on Marlow's back. Warmth moved beneath the thick coat. Marlow did not look toward the broken bell. After a few seconds, he turned toward the waiting fuel sleds below the hill. Their engines were running. The people at the recovery center were still waiting. Everett looked once more at the chapel. "Let's go." Dana led the convoy on the first snowmobile. A second snowmobile followed the low sled carrying sealed diesel containers, a replacement fuel filter, tools, and emergency heating equipment. Everett rode in the support vehicle behind them as route advisor. Marlow had been rested, given water, and checked for signs of cold stress before Dana allowed him to accompany the team. The dog would work only along the lower, previously surveyed portion of the route. The service road descended beneath the chapel embankment and curved into the northern grove. Snow had filled the shallow drainage channels, but the road surface remained visible beneath the vehicle lights. The seven-station network followed their progress. Stonebridge reported the condition of the lower crossing. The timber mill transmitted wind speed and direction. The pumping station relayed the falling temperature. At the mountain lodge, a signal lamp marked the higher side of the route, where drifting snow had covered the roadside posts. Each report reached Nora at the fire station. Nora confirmed the information through a second station before sending instructions to the convoy. The process took longer than Everett's instincts preferred. It also left less room for a single mistake. Near the northern grove, Everett recognized a narrow maintenance cut branching away from the road. He leaned toward the vehicle radio. "That cut rejoins the main route above the switchback. It would save 20 minutes. Nora's voice answered, "Provide the coordinates." Everett read them from the map. The pumping station could not see the cut. The lodge signal operator reported that the upper end was hidden by blowing snow. Stonebridge had no direct view. Only one station could confirm that the route had once been open. Nora rejected it. "We stay on the approved road." Everett looked through the windshield at the narrow entrance. Years earlier, he had driven county trucks through that cut in worse visibility. He could have argued. He could have said experience counted as confirmation. Instead, he replied, "Understood." The convoy continued along the longer route. 20 minutes later, the lodge reported that a wind-loaded branch had fallen across the upper end of the shortcut. The obstruction might have been cleared, but stopping the fuel sled beneath snow-heavy trees would have created another unnecessary risk. Everett marked the cut as closed on his map. No satisfaction came from being partly right about the road and fully wrong about the decision. The recovery center appeared through the trees shortly before the generator's auxiliary tank reached its critical level. The stone lodge stood dark except for the western wing, where several windows still held a soft yellow glow. Ruth Delgado waited beneath the entrance canopy, wearing a plum-colored parka over her teal medical scrubs. Her silver curls were tucked beneath a gray knit cap, and her red-framed glasses had fogged at the edges. "You brought the whole weather system with you," she said as Dana approached. "We tried to leave part of it behind." Ruth pointed toward the utility room. "The generator is still running. The main filter is nearly blocked." Silas had sent written instructions with the replacement parts. A county maintenance worker shut down the feed system, replaced the wax-clogged filter, and introduced the winter-treated diesel from the sealed containers. The generator stabilized, but the technician's expression remained cautious. "The feed line is moving again," he said, "but the temperature is still falling. We cannot guarantee it stays clear through the night." Nora's voice came over Dana's radio. "Fuel delivery was intended to extend safe operating time. Begin controlled evacuation." Ruth nodded as though she had expected nothing else. Inside the West Common Room, the staff had gathered the residents beneath blankets near two portable heaters. No one was panicking. Ruth had organized medication, records, and essential belongings into labeled bags. Walter Keene sat in a wooden chair near the door. At 71, he was tall and lean, with silver hair combed back and a narrow white mustache. A dark wooden cane rested beside one knee. Beneath his navy fleece coat, he wore a cream cable-knit sweater. "I will take the last vehicle," he told Ruth. "You will take the first. There are people here who move more slowly." "You are one of them," Walter frowned. "I was a medic for 27 years. Then you know why I need someone calm in the first group." Walter looked toward the other residents. Ruth continued before he could argue. "You are not being sent first because you matter more. You are going first because you can help the others remain steady." The change in responsibility reached him where an order about age could not. Walter took his cane and stood. "Fine," he said, "but I am sitting near the door." "You may sit wherever you are least dramatic." The first group left in the support vehicle, with Walter speaking quietly to two other residents during the descent. The second group followed in the snowcat. Staff members checked every room before the final departure. No one was left to prove courage. No one was moved ahead because of rank or history. The fuel did not solve the crisis. It purchased enough warmth and light for an orderly evacuation. On the return journey, the 7 stations answered one another across the valley. A small mine bell sounded from Stonebridge. The timber mill replied with its air horn. A white signal lamp flashed from the lodge. Short radio confirmations passed through the pumping station and upper depot. None of those signals possessed the deep voice of the old bell at St. Luke's. Yet each sound had someone waiting to receive it. When the last vehicle entered the fire station bay, the storm had begun to weaken. Dana climbed down first. Marlow followed, landing lightly on the concrete. He remained beside Dana until she unclipped the working line and gave the release command. Only then did he walk to Everett. Everett rested one hand against the dog's neck. He looked at Dana. "Thank you for bringing him back safely." Dana removed her gloves. "Marlow is not something I brought back." Everett waited. "He is part of the team," she said. "He worked. He finished. Then he came home." Marlow lowered himself onto the floor between them. One side of his body touched Everett's boot. The other pressed against Dana's. Everett looked down at the dog. For years, he had mistaken loyalty for a line that belonged to only 2 points. Marlow had made it something wider. Sharing trust had not weakened the bond between them. It had given that bond somewhere useful to go. Across the valley, 7 smaller signals continued answering one another while the great bell at St. Luke's remained silent. The council chamber had never seemed large to Everett Sloan. That evening, it felt smaller than the bell tower. Every chair was occupied. Road crews stood along the back wall beside volunteers from the fire station. Several residents from the recovery center sat near the aisle. Colin Price had taken a seat in the second row, his broad arms folded across his mustard-colored work jacket. Marlow waited outside the chamber with Dana. Everett had asked for that. This was not a moment in which he wanted the dog's presence to soften what needed to be said. He stood alone before the White Elk Council, wearing a dark blue flannel shirt, charcoal work pants, and an old brown canvas jacket. No medals rested on his chest. No military insignia appeared on his clothes. The black watch remained on his left wrist, its scratched face catching the overhead light whenever he moved his hand. The council chair opened the meeting. Mr. Sloan, you requested the opportunity to make a statement before the safety review. Everett looked across the room. Some faces held anger, others held disappointment. A few people looked at him with the cautious sympathy offered to someone they no longer fully trusted. He did not search for the easiest expression. I inspected the upper assembly at St. Luke's before the storm, he said. I saw a crack in the hanging lug. I found a piece of bronze beneath it. No one interrupted. I did not record the full damage. I kept the fragment. That night, a second piece fell, and I kept that one too. The room remained still. I told myself the bell could be used with limited force. I told myself Lydia's scheduled inspection was close enough. The truth is that I was afraid a complete report would lead to the bell being removed. Everett paused. That fear influenced a safety decision I had no authority to make. He could have explained what the bell meant. He could have spoken about Daniel Mercer and Owen Rusk, about the last operation, or about the years in which St. Luke's had been the one place where memory seemed to remain orderly. He did not. Those things explained his choice. They did not excuse it. The failed signal contributed to Colin and 2 county workers being stranded on the eastern route, Everett continued. Other people corrected what I failed to report. Nora reorganized the response, Dana led the search, Silas and Lydia handled the bell. The 7 stations carried the messages that St. Luke's could not. He looked toward Colin. I am responsible for withholding information that should have been available to them. Colin did not nod. Everett had not expected him to. The council suspended Everett from all public equipment inspections. He could continue road maintenance work, but only under supervision. Any observation involving structural safety, communication systems, or emergency routes would require review and a second signature. He would also complete retraining in incident command, risk reporting, and shared decision-making before serving as an emergency advisor again. The decision was not temporary punishment designed to satisfy the room. It changed the authority Everett had spent years building. He accepted every condition. When the meeting ended, several residents left without speaking to him. Colin remained. Everett approached carefully. I should have told you sooner. Yes, Colin said. The answer was plain. Everett waited, but Colin offered nothing more. Months earlier, Everett might have filled that silence with explanation. This time, he let Colin keep it. At the chamber door, Dana stood with Marlow. The dog rose when Everett appeared, but Dana did not release him until the working line had been unclipped. Marlow crossed the hallway and pressed his shoulder briefly against Everett's leg. Dana looked through the open doorway at the emptying council room. How did it go? The way it should have? That is not the same as going well. No. They walked outside together. White Elk still carried visible marks from the storm. Broken branches had been stacked beside the road. Temporary cable hung where the western line had failed. St. Luke's Tower stood without its bell, the open chamber dark above the snowy hill. For the first time, Everett did not look away from the empty space. The weeks that followed were quieter than the storm, and more difficult in a different way. Everett returned to road work under Colin's supervision. Their first assignment involved checking drainage markers along the northern service road. At one bend, Everett noticed that the snowpack had settled unevenly above a culvert. Possible blockage, he said. Colin removed a measuring rod from the truck. Possible? Everett felt the old answer rise first. He had seen this pattern before. He knew what it meant. There was no reason to waste time confirming what experience had already made obvious. Instead, he said, I have not checked the outlet. They walked the ditch together. The outlet was partly blocked, though less severely than Everett expected. Colin recorded the measurement, signed the report, and passed the clipboard across the hood. Everett added his name beneath Colin's. It was a small procedure. It felt like rebuilding a bridge one board at a time. Not every relationship improves so quickly. Some volunteers stopped asking Everett for advice. At the fire station, conversations occasionally became shorter when he entered. A former neighbor who once called him whenever ice formed on her roof now called the county office instead. Everett noticed each change. He did not complain about any of them. Trust had been given to him over many years. He had no right to demand that it return on his preferred schedule. During retraining, Nora placed Everett at the back of the incident command classroom rather than beside her at the instructor's table. The course involved emergency roles, communication chains, uncertainty statements, and the difference between observations, recommendations, and orders. Everett disliked the written exercises. One page presented an incomplete weather report and asked participants to decide whether a mountain route should remain open. He studied the map for less than a minute and wrote, "Route likely unsafe." Nora read the answer. "What confirms it?" "The wind direction and slope angle." "Do we have current wind speed?" "No." "Do we know whether the road crew reached the upper marker?" "No." "Then what can you conclude?" Everett looked at the page again. The old instinct told him the answer was obvious. The new discipline required him to separate what he suspected from what he could prove. He crossed out the sentence and wrote, "Insufficient data to conclude. Recommend holding movement until field confirmation is received." Nora returned the page. Better. Everett kept that exercise. He placed it inside the same field notebook in which he had once written that the bell could remain in service. Spring came late to White Elk. When the snow withdrew from St. Luke's Hill, Lydia Mercer conducted a full inspection of the tower. The stone walls remained stable and the upper frame could be repaired. The chapel would stay. The great bell could not be restored to its original form. Its 3 large bronze sections were moved to a foundry within the state. Lydia proposed recasting the material into 7 smaller bells, one for each station that had carried White Elk through the storm. The council approved the plan. Everett did not ask to control the design. He made one request. Daniel Mercer's and Owen Rusk's names would be engraved inside the bell assigned to St. Luke's, where they would remain present without being placed above anyone else. At the fire station, a separate plaque would list every person and station involved in the winter response. The lettering would be the same size from top to bottom. Nora's name was no larger than the volunteers who carried batteries through the snow. Everett's name appeared once. Marlow's appeared beneath the search team listing. Summer changed the valley completely. The white slopes turned green. Meltwater ran beneath Stone Bridge. Crews installed backup batteries, protected power lines, fixed signal lamps, and weatherproofed radio cabinets at all 7 stations. Everett worked mostly where he was assigned. Sometimes that meant driving materials. Sometimes it meant reading old maintenance records. Sometimes it meant standing beside a younger technician and explaining how wind moved through a section of the valley, then waiting while the technician verified the claim against current data. Dana continued training Marlow twice a week. At first, Everett attended every session. He stood beyond the course boundary and followed each movement with the intensity of a man trying not to interfere. One morning, Dana guided Marlow through a scent trail near the river. The dog paused at a fork, tested the air, and chose the less obvious path. Everett saw a change in the wind and nearly called out. He stopped himself. Dana saw it too. She adjusted the line, gave Marlow more space, and allowed him to work the scent cone. The dog found the hidden volunteer. Dana rewarded him. Everett remained silent until the exercise ended. "You saw the shift," he said. Dana coiled the line into 3 even loops. "Yes." "I almost said something." "I know." "How?" "You touched your watch." Everett looked at his left wrist. Dana smiled slightly. "You are quieter now. You are not invisible." Over time, Everett stopped attending every exercise. Marlow would leave the cabin with Dana in the morning and return in the afternoon tired, content, and carrying the scent of pine, snowmelt, or machine oil in his coat. The first few times, Everett waited by the window. Later, he learned to continue with his day. Marlow always came home. Nearly 1 year after the storm, the first snow returned to White Elk. The sky was clear and intensely blue. Sunlight reflected from the valley until every roof, road, and tree line appeared sharply defined. The town gathered to test the permanent 7-station network. At St. Luke's, the new bell hung beneath a reinforced frame. It was smaller than the original, with a clean bronze surface and a darker band around its base. Inside, where only a person standing close could see, were the names Daniel Mercer and Owen Rusk. Everett stood outside the chapel with Nora, Dana, Silas, Lydia, Colin, Ruth, and Walter. Walter no longer needed the cane every day, though he carried it on the icy hill. Ruth wore her plum parka and red-framed glasses. Silas had his old mine cap pulled low over his ears. Colin held a steel thermos but did not drink from it. Marlow sat among them. He did not place himself in front of Everett or Dana. He simply watched the valley with both ears directed toward the first station. Nora checked her watch. "Begin!" The bell at St. Luke's sounded once. Its voice was clear but modest. No one moved. Across the valley, Stone Bridge confirmed the signal with the second bell. The timber mill answered after receiving confirmation. Then came the pumping station, the mountain lodge, and the upper maintenance depot. Light, radio, and bronze carried the message forward according to the plan. At each stage, someone waited. Someone checked, someone answered. The 7th signal arrived from the far side of the valley. Everett listened as its sound traveled through the cold air. He expected to hear loss. Instead, he heard distance being crossed. He heard people making themselves accountable to one another. Colin stood beside him. "Clean signal," Everett said. Colin glanced toward the station lights. "Confirmed by 2 points." It was not forgiveness, it was something more useful, a statement they could both trust. That evening, Everett stayed for dinner at the fire station. A long table had been arranged between the equipment bays. Ruth argued with Silas about whether chili needed beans. Walter told a story that grew less believable each time someone questioned it. Dana sat near Nora, while Colin passed Everett a basket of bread without making the gesture feel important. Marlow lay in the middle of the room. From that position, he could see the front entrance, the equipment doors, and the hallway leading to the radio room. He did not guard any one of them. He slept. When Everett finally returned to the cabin, the valley was quiet beneath moonlit snow. Marlow walked inside and settled near the wood stove. Everett closed the door. He turned the lock once. His hand remained on the knob. For years he had checked it a second time. The action had become so familiar that his body expected it before his mind decided. He looked across the room. Marlow was already lying on his side. His curved left ear relaxed against the floor. The dog had not taken his usual position facing the door. Everett released the handle. The lock remained as it was. One turn. One confirmed action. Enough. He removed his scratched black watch and placed it on the table beside the field notebook. Inside the notebook, one sentence remained visible from his retraining exercise. Insufficient data to conclude. Everett no longer saw uncertainty as a weakness. It was a signal. A warning that belonged in the open, where someone else could hear it. Outside, the 7 small bells waited across the valley. None was strong enough to speak for White Elk alone. That was why the town could trust them. Everett sat near the stove while Marlow slept without watching the door. He finally understood that the duty of a watchman was not to remain the only person awake. It was to admit when his signal had become unreliable, place responsibility in other capable hands, and wait for an answer from the other side of the valley. Sometimes the hardest act of courage is not holding on, but admitting when our judgment is no longer enough. Everett learned that responsibility does not mean carrying every burden alone. It means telling the truth, accepting correction, and trusting others to answer when our own signal fails. In everyday life, we may not stand beneath a broken bell, but we all face moments when pride asks us to stay silent and integrity asks us to speak. May God give us the humility to choose what protects the living, the strength to make things right, and the wisdom to listen for the voices answering from across our own valleys. Share what this story meant to you in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances.